Margaret stood on the porch, clutching her black shawl, when the cruel words sliced through the silence. "This house is mine now, Margaret," said Clara, her daughter-in-law. "You can leave whenever you like. Actually, the sooner the better." It was the morning after Margaret had buried her only son, Daniel. Her heart was already raw with grief, but Clara's cold tone was like salt rubbed into a wound. The widow who should have been mourning was instead staking her claim. Margaret felt her knees weaken. The will reading was set for the following week. Clara smirked as if the outcome was already decided. "I hope you enjoy the taste of being homeless, Margaret," she whispered to her while guests still lingered after the funeral. Margaret bowed her head, refusing to argue in public. Deep down she reminded herself, sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people reveal who they really are. The nightmare had started days earlier, with a call that shattered Margaret's world. At 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, her phone rang. Daniel's voice came through, trembling. "Mom, something's wrong." "I can't." The line went dead. Margaret froze in terror. She raced to the hospital only to hear the doctor say with practiced detachment, "Massive heart attack. Nothing more we could do." Her son, only 45, was gone. Clara stood in the waiting room, her face pale, but Margaret caught a flicker in her eyes. Was it relief? No, she told herself firmly. She was drowning in grief. Surely she was imagining things. Still, Clara's voice was cold when she finally spoke. "Now we deal with reality, Margaret. Daniel's gone. I'll have to make decisions." Margaret tried to hold the pieces of her family together. She reached for Clara's hand. "We'll get through this together, dear." But Clara pulled away, replying flatly, "We'll see about that." The words echoed in Margaret's mind like a storm warning. The days before the funeral were a blur of arrangements. Clara insisted she would handle everything herself. "I'm his wife. I know what he would have wanted," she repeated whenever Margaret offered help. So Margaret focused on writing Daniel's eulogy and phoning relatives. At 67, she had buried parents and a husband, but losing her child was a special kind of hell. On the night before the funeral, Margaret sat in Daniel's old childhood bedroom, staring at framed photos. Daniel graduating college. Daniel's wedding day. Daniel holding a nephew at Christmas. Yet none showed mother and son together in recent years. She realized Clara had carefully removed them. The truth sank in. She had been erased. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Clara stood in the doorway, her face calm but her eyes sharp as glass. "We need to talk, Margaret." Her tone made it clear this was not an invitation but an order. The funeral itself was flawless. White lilies lined the chapel, a choir sang Daniel's favorite hymns, and the reception was polished. Yet Margaret noticed Clara's performance as the grieving widow was laced with pointed remarks. "New chapters," she murmured to guests. "Fresh starts." Then Margaret overheard Clara speaking to her sister near the flowers. "The life insurance will cover the mortgage for 2 years. And without extra expenses we'll be fine." "Extra expenses? What about Margaret?" Clara's sister asked softly. Clara laughed low and sharp. "That's not my problem. She can figure out her own life like the rest of us adults." Margaret's blood ran cold. She had sold her home 2 years earlier, giving Clara and Daniel $40,000 to help buy this very house. Daniel had promised it was only temporary until she found something smaller. But temporary had turned into permanent, and she had believed she belonged. Now she saw just how wrong she had been. Later that evening, Clara appeared at Margaret's elbow, her smile as polished as crystal. "Could you help me in the kitchen?" she asked sweetly. Margaret nodded, following her through the crowd of mourners. Behind the closed kitchen door, Clara's mask slipped. "Let's be direct," she said flatly. "This house is in Daniel's name, which means it's mine. I need my privacy. You being here, well, it complicates things." Margaret steadied her trembling voice. "Clara, I understand you're grieving, but surely—" "No," Clara interrupted, raising her hand. I've made my decision. Tomorrow evening your things need to be gone. The words struck Margaret like a hammer. She searched Clara's face for any hint of compassion but found only steel. Where exactly do you expect me to go? Margaret whispered. Clara's lips curved in a mocking smile. You're a grown woman, Margaret. You'll figure something out. David would have wanted me to move forward, and I don't need you in my way. Margaret felt her chest tighten. David would be horrified if he heard you speak like this. Clara's voice turned icy. David is dead. Accept it. That night, Margaret packed her life into 4 suitcases and 2 boxes. 67 years reduced to what would fit in the trunk of her car. As she folded her clothes, she prayed Clara would appear, apologize, and tell her she could stay until she found a new place. But Clara never came. At precisely 6 o'clock the next evening, Clara appeared in the doorway with her arms crossed. Time's up, Margaret. The older woman zipped her final suitcase and looked around the bare room that had once felt like a refuge. I'll need a few more minutes to carry everything out, she murmured. I'll help, Clara said coldly. It wasn't kindness, it was control. They made 3 silent trips to the car. When the last box was in the trunk, Margaret turned to Clara. Her voice shook with restrained dignity. I don't know why you're angry with me, Clara. I only wish I knew what I'd done wrong. Clara's eyes were flat. You didn't do anything wrong. You just exist in my space. Daniel felt sorry for you, but I don't. Margaret nodded slowly, the cruelty settling like frost in her chest. She lowered the car window. At least tell me if there will be a formal reading of Daniel's will. Surely he left something. Why would he leave you anything? Clara asked, her tone puzzled. You're not his wife, and you never contributed to this household. Margaret almost laughed. The $40,000 she had given them for the down payment would disagree, but she kept silent. She drove away without looking back, her heart heavy. The Hampton Inn on Route 9 became her temporary shelter. The hotel room smelled of bleach and stale carpet. She sat on the stiff bedspread, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Who was this woman? A widow, childless, and now homeless. Clara thought she had one. But in the quiet of that sterile room, something unexpected stirred in Margaret. Beneath the despair was a flicker of anticipation. Clara had underestimated Daniel. He had always been a better son than his wife believed. Margaret sensed, deep down, that something was waiting to be revealed. 2 weeks later, as Margaret worried about her dwindling savings, the phone rang. Mrs. Fairfield. This is James Morrison from Morrison & Associates. I handled your son's legal affairs. Margaret's breath caught. Yes, I remember you. There will be a formal reading of Daniel's will next Tuesday at 2 p.m. in my office, he explained. Your presence is required. Margaret blinked in shock. Clara had insisted there was nothing for her. But Daniel's lawyer had just said otherwise. The word required echoed in Margaret's ears long after the call ended. She sat straighter on the bed, ignoring the way the old mattress groaned beneath her. Clara had spoken with such certainty, as though Daniel would never have remembered his own mother. But if James Morrison said she was named in the will, then Daniel had left her something. Perhaps only a keepsake, maybe his father's old watch or family photos, but still, it was proof she mattered. Over the next few days, Margaret began browsing modest apartments online. Her savings could cover another week at the hotel, plus first month's rent and deposit for a small 1-bedroom. Social Security and her teaching pension would have to stretch further now. She reminded herself, this was not the end. Maybe Daniel had left her something that would help. On Tuesday, Margaret parked outside Morrison & Associates 15 minutes early. Her palms were damp as she watched Clara step out of a gleaming silver BMW. The younger woman wore a sleek black dress that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly pension. At her side was a man in a tailored suit, her brother Marcus. He looked like he was ready for battle. Inside the reception area, Clara's expression darkened at the sight of Margaret. What is she doing here? She snapped. Mrs. Fairfield is here for the will reading, the receptionist replied calmly. Which Mrs. Fairfield? Clara's voice rose sharply. Marcus leaned toward her, whispering something, and Clara finally sank into a chair opposite Margaret, her glare like a blade. James Morrison appeared right at 2 o'clock. He was a silver-haired man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Ladies, gentlemen," he said warmly. "I know this is difficult, but Daniel was very specific about his wishes." He gestured toward his office. "Shall we?" The three of them followed him inside, Clara moving with the confidence of someone certain she would get everything. The reading began with the obvious. The house, the cars, the retirement accounts, the life insurance. All left to Clara. She nodded at each mention, her satisfaction barely concealed. Occasionally she glanced at Margaret with smug triumph. Margaret folded her hands quietly, bracing herself for the inevitable disappointment. Then Morrison cleared his throat, his tone shifting slightly. "There is one final provision Daniel added just 3 months ago." Clara stiffened, her smirk fading. Marcus put down his pen. Margaret's breath caught. The room suddenly felt charged, as though everyone sensed a storm about to break. "To my mother, Margaret Fairfield," Morrison read, "who provided the down payment for our home and never asked for repayment, I leave the contents of Safety Deposit Box 3537 at First National Bank, along with all associated documentation and accounts contained therein." Clara bolted upright. "What safety deposit box? Daniel never had one." Her voice dripped with fury. Morrison looked up, unruffled. "Apparently he did. He was very specific that it belonged solely to his mother." Margaret blinked in disbelief. Daniel had never mentioned a safety deposit box to her. What had he been keeping hidden all these years? "This is ridiculous," Clara hissed. "If there's anything valuable in that box, it should be part of the estate. We'll contest this." Morrison remained calm. "You're free to try, but the provision is valid. Daniel was competent when he signed it. I witnessed the document myself." He looked at Margaret kindly. "Your son wanted you to have this, Mrs. Fairfield." Very deliberately. Margaret pressed her trembling hands together. For the first time since Daniel's death, hope flickered. Clara shoved her chair back so hard it scraped the polished floor. "Come on, Marcus," she snapped. "We'll deal with this later." But Morrison raised a hand. "Before you leave, there's one more detail. Daniel left instructions that his mother must access the safety deposit box within a few days. The bank requires identification, the death certificate, and this." He handed Margaret a sealed envelope. "The key." Clara's eyes burned holes through Margaret. "I'm coming with you to the bank," she declared. Morrison shook his head. "I'm afraid not. Access is restricted to Mrs. Fairfield only." That was Daniel's explicit request. Clara's lips parted in disbelief. "This is insane. How do we even know there's anything in the box?" Morrison smiled faintly. "We'll know soon enough." Outside in the parking lot, Clara cornered Margaret near her car. Her voice was syrupy, but her eyes were venomous. "Margaret, let's be reasonable. Whatever's in that box, we should share it. Daniel would have wanted me to benefit too." Margaret almost laughed. "That's curious. A week ago you said Daniel would never leave me anything. Now suddenly you're eager to divide it." Clara's mask slipped. "Don't forget, Margaret, you're homeless. You need me more than I need you." Margaret gripped her car door. Her voice was calm, steady. "Actually, Clara, I don't think I need you at all." She slid into the driver's seat, the envelope clutched tightly in her lap. 3 business days later, Margaret walked into First National Bank, escorted by the manager, Mrs. Peterson. The woman offered condolences and led her down into the vault. "Box 3537 is one of our larger units," she explained. "Your son rented it 5 years ago and visited regularly." Margaret's heart raced. Daniel had been planning something for years. The manager used a master key while Margaret inserted Daniel's. The heavy box slid forward. Mrs. Peterson placed it on a table in a private viewing room. "Take your time," she said gently, leaving Margaret alone. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted the lid. The first thing she saw was an envelope addressed in Daniel's familiar handwriting. "Mom," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. And by now, Clara has shown you who she really is. I'm sorry you had to face her cruelty. But I've been preparing for this." Margaret pressed the paper to her chest before reading further. "You gave us $40,000 for the house," the letter continued. "You thought of it as a loan, though you never asked for repayment. I've been investing that money for 5 years, adding more whenever possible. The accounts inside are yours, not just repayment, but what that money has grown into." Margaret's breath quickened. She sifted through the documents. Account numbers, statements, balances. Her eyes widened. One account alone held over $185,000. Daniel's letter went on. "I also know Clara told people you contributed nothing. What she doesn't admit is that I've paid the mortgage myself the whole time. Every cent you gave us went into investments for your future. And I've kept records. Emails, texts, even credit card bills. You'll find them in the folder marked Documentation." Margaret's hands shook as she opened the thick folder, filled with proof of years of deceit. The final lines of Daniel's letter blurred as tears filled her eyes. "You deserve better than how she treated you, Mom. Take this money and build a life where no one can make you feel unwanted again. And don't tell Clara until you're safely away. Trust me on this. All my love, Daniel." Margaret sat in the vault room for nearly an hour, clutching the letter, feeling her son's love wrap around her even in death. Clara had thought she'd won, but Daniel had written a different ending. When Margaret finally emerged from the vault, Mrs. Peterson was waiting with a kind smile. "Shall I help you secure these documents?" she asked. Margaret nodded, handing over the folder and bank statements. Together, they organized the papers into a large envelope. "You'll need to complete a few forms to access the funds," Mrs. Peterson explained. "But everything here belongs to you." Margaret thanked her, her voice thick with emotion. As Margaret walked toward her car, her phone buzzed. Clara's name lit the screen. She hesitated, then answered. "Margaret," Clara cooed, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Why don't you come by for lunch? We could discuss things." Margaret almost laughed. A week ago, Clara had tossed her into the street. Now she wanted lunch. "No, thank you," Margaret said firmly. "I have my own plans." Clara's tone sharpened. "Don't be foolish. Whatever was in that box, it should benefit both of us. Daniel was my husband." Margaret's lips curved in a calm smile. "And he was my son. His wishes were clear. I won't discuss this further." She ended the call before Clara could reply. That evening, Margaret spread the documents across the hotel desk. The numbers were overwhelming. $185,000 in investments, plus additional accounts tied to Daniel's name but listed under her as beneficiary. For the first time in weeks, she felt secure. Daniel had given her more than money. He had given her freedom. The next morning, Clara showed up at the hotel. Margaret opened the door to find her standing there, eyes flashing with barely concealed anger. "We need to talk," Clara said, pushing her way inside. "How dare you shut me out like this? That money should be mine." Margaret crossed her arms. "Daniel left it to me. His decision, not yours." Clara paced the small room, her heels clicking against the tile. "Do you realize how hard it is to manage everything on my own? The house, the bills." Margaret cut her off. "The house you insisted was yours. The bills Daniel paid without telling me. Bear me, Clara. I've read his letters. I know the truth." Clara froze, color draining from her face. You're lying," she stammered. Margaret calmly slid the folder across the desk. "Proof," she said simply. "Emails, statements, screenshots. Daniel documented everything. I don't need your permission to live my life." Clara's hands trembled as she flipped through the papers. Her facade cracked. "He planned this behind my back. Margaret stood tall, her grief replaced by a quiet strength. Daniel trusted me with this. He knew who you were, Clara. You revealed it yourself the moment you put me out of that house. Clara's eyes filled with rage. I'll fight you in court. Margaret's voice was steady. Go ahead. But Daniel was precise. You won't win. For a moment, silence filled the hotel room. Then Clara slammed the folder shut and stormed out, her heels echoing down the hallway. Margaret exhaled slowly, her hands shaking. She had faced Clara's cruelty and stood her ground. For the first time, she no longer felt like a helpless widow. She felt like a woman with choices. That night, Margaret sat by the window, looking out at the neon lights of passing cars. She whispered softly, "Thank you, Daniel." Her son had seen further than she ever imagined. He had given her the tools to rebuild, to live with dignity. And though the pain of losing him remained, Margaret felt a seed of something new in her chest, hope. In the days that followed, Margaret began making plans. She met with Mr. Morrison again, who guided her through transferring the investment accounts into her name. He smiled kindly as she signed the final papers. Your son was a thoughtful man, Mrs. Fairfield. He wanted to ensure you'd be cared for. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. He always did. Meanwhile, Clara's calls grew more frantic. One voicemail dripped with rage. You think you've won, Margaret? This isn't over. Another was pitiful, her voice trembling. Please. I can't do this alone. Margaret listened to them once, then deleted each message. Daniel had warned her, don't tell Clara until you're safely away. She decided to honor his advice. With her finances secured, Margaret began visiting senior living communities. She found a small cottage-style apartment on the edge of town. The rent was modest, the neighbors friendly, and the garden space reminded her of the roses she once grew in her old home. Standing in the empty living room, she felt a strange sense of peace. This could be hers. On moving day, her sister flew in from Phoenix to help. Together they carried Margaret's boxes into the new apartment. It's cozy, her sister said warmly, hanging curtains by the window. Margaret smiled. It's freedom. For the first time in weeks, laughter bubbled in her chest. That evening, Clara appeared one last time. She stood outside the new apartment, her expression a mix of fury and desperation. Daniel was mine, she hissed. Everything he had should be mine. Margaret shook her head. Daniel belonged to no one. He was his own man. And he chose to honor his mother. Clara's face twisted. You'll regret crossing me. No, Margaret said softly. The only regret I have is trusting you for so long. She closed the door gently but firmly, shutting Clara out of her life for good. Weeks passed, and Margaret settled into her new routine. She tended her small garden, cooked simple meals, and joined a local book club. People began to know her not as the widow or the grieving mother, but simply as Margaret, a woman with dignity and strength. Sometimes late at night, she would reread Daniel's letter. His words wrapped around her like a blanket, steadying her. You deserve better, Mom. She would touch the paper gently and whisper back, I'm trying, Daniel. I'm living the life you wanted for me. One afternoon, while watering her roses, a neighbor waved from across the fence. Lovely flowers you've got there, he said. Margaret smiled, realizing she was no longer invisible, no longer erased. Life, in its quiet way, was offering her a second chance. Margaret stood in her garden as the sun dipped low, casting golden light across her new home. Clara had tried to strip her of everything, her shelter, her dignity, her worth. But Daniel's love had built her a new